If you have your Bible, you can turn to Ephesians chapter 12, or excuse me, Ephesians chapter 6. There is no Ephesians chapter 12. We're going to read verse 12 of Ephesians chapter 6. And we're going to talk about 4 categories of Satan's spiritual forces. We see them here. Paul writing, he says, "For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this age, against spiritual hosts of wickedness in the heavenly places." Now I'm reading out of the New King James Version, so it might be slightly different than what you have, but we see 4 categories of spiritual forces here. So you may be wondering, why are we talking about Satan's spiritual forces? And that is because we do not need to be ignorant of our enemy. And in fact, Paul even wrote about that in Corinthians. He said that he would not have us be ignorant of his devices. And we see it in the natural realm. Militaries will study their opponents, find their strategies and their which weapons they have available to them so that they can best combat their enemies. And then even we see it in sports teams and business. Organizations will study their opponents or their competition in order to understand what they are up against so that they can best combat or compete with their opponent. And so we also ought to know how Satan operates in these 4 categories of his spiritual forces. Because remember, we talked about a couple of weeks ago that ignorance is one of the reasons why bad things happen. And so if we are not familiar with how Satan operates, then we may not combat him in the appropriate way for that attack. But we are going to cover a lot of information in this. It's just one verse, but there's a ton of information that we're going to get into. I really thought it was going to be kind of a simple, very organized, laid out message with 4 categories. It's very easy to make an outline of a 4-category verse. But then as I was going over it last night, I realized there's a ton of information in here, and it's probably going to be too much to take all at once. So even if we do really fly through the first half of this message, I'm most likely going to split it up into 2 nights. So we will do half of it tonight and then the other half next time. But we need to, after we're finished with this message, and maybe even after tonight, there's so much information that's going out that you will learn far more about spiritual warfare and about these categories of Satan's spiritual forces than most Christians know. And that's actually kind of disappointing because Paul is very, very descriptive in this teaching of the armor of God and in these 4 categories. But we'll go through it. Hopefully not too fast because there's going to be so much information. Some of it might be a little much to take in, but you can watch the video and you can watch it again if you need to until you really understand this topic. Now, we see that there are 4 categories of Satan's spiritual forces: principalities, powers, rulers of the darkness in this age, and spiritual hosts of wickedness in the heavenly places. So this demonic categorization is actually very structured and organized. So we know that that is not something Satan could have come up with on his own. Because we know that God is a God of order. You can turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 14 to see this. First Corinthians 14, verse 33. It says, "God is not the author of confusion, but of peace." And the Amplified says, "God is not the author of confusion and disorder, but of peace and order." And then in Genesis chapter 1, we see God bringing order to chaos. And so God is a God of order, which means that Satan cannot be a being of order. Satan is a being of disorder. So how did he come up with, you can go back to Ephesians chapter 6, how did he come up with such a well-structured, organized categorization of spiritual forces? And the answer is because he may not be a being of order, but he is a counterfeiter and a copier and a perverter. And Satan was once Lucifer, who was one of God's angels. And so he saw the structure of angelic beings that God had created. There were archangels like Michael. There were lower angels. There are created beings, which all they do is fly around the throne saying, "Holy, holy, holy." It is a very structured organization that God has created for angelic beings, because God is a God of order. And so when Satan fell, different classes or ranks of angels fell with him, and so he just organized them similar to how they were organized before the fall. There was a high-ranking angel before the fall. Most likely he was going to become a high-ranking demon. And we may not see this from the English language that this letter is translated into, where Paul says we wrestle against principalities, powers, rulers of the darkness of this age, and spiritual hosts of wickedness in the heavenly places. So it's easy for us to just read through this verse and think, okay, he's saying, obviously we don't wrestle against flesh and blood. We understand that. We wrestle against spiritual powers. But if we dig into each one of these words, we see that each of these words has a very specific meaning. We may understand what principalities are, but hardly anyone can just read that we wrestle against powers and really understand what Paul is saying here. Certainly not pertaining to rulers of the darkness of this age, and absolutely not again when he's talking about spiritual hosts of wickedness in the heavenly places. We'll talk about that most likely next week. Let's go through each of these 4 categories. I'll probably do 3 tonight, and then end with, on a good note. I don't want to end on talking about Satan's spiritual forces, but we need to knowing what his categorization of these spiritual forces are, how do we combat that, or what do we do about that? And so we'll end tonight on that topic, and then we'll pick up next week and talk more about the 4th categorization, and then end with even more information about what we do. So the way I'm going to go through this message is we will discuss each of these 4 categorizations, looking at what the original Greek says, and then also some other information from the guy that I listen to often, Rick Renner. He's written about this topic many times in his books, The Sparkling Gems. He's got a lot of teaching about it. And so with the different tools that I use, as well as some information from him where he has taught about this over the years, we really get a great understanding of what each of these 4 categories mean. So first, Paul talks about principalities. We do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities. You may know what a principality is, but it is the Greek word archos, and this signifies priority. It is a point of derivation or originating moment. It is one who enjoys preeminence. It is an assigned position or sphere of activity. And by the way, I'm getting those definitions from these lexicons, which I brought. So I've got a concise one. This is the one that I use the most often. It has every Greek word from the New Testament, actually even from the Septuagint, the Old Testament as well. And then just a brief definition or multiple definitions of what that Greek word means. And so I'm not just pulling these definitions out of thin air. I am researching each of these words, and then also taking what Rick Renner has taught about, because he is fluent in the Greek language that the New Testament was written in. Another definition of this word archos is an authority figure who initiates activity or process. And so these are all you can see there. They are describing some being that is very high ranking, where actions originate with this being. And Rick Renner said that this can describe a ruler of a nation or a chief general of an army. We see that Paul is often using military language throughout this book, and specifically in relation to his teaching on the armor of God here in chapter 6. And so this is descriptive of a general, a high-ranking chief general of an army. So this means that Paul is saying we are not wrestling against flesh and blood. We don't wrestle against physical beings. But one category of spiritual being that we wrestle against is a principality, which is a very high-ranking general in Satan's military. We see this in Daniel chapter 10. We covered this some on Sunday, where Daniel was praying. Daniel chapter 10, verses 12 and 13. Daniel prayed, and then 21 days later, an angel appeared to him. And verse 12 says, "Then he said to me, 'Do not fear, Daniel, for from the first day that you set your heart to understand and to humble yourself before your God, your words were heard, and I have come because of your words.'" So the first moment that Daniel prayed, this angel was dispatched from heaven. And we'll talk about this next week. One of the reasons I'm splitting this into 2 nights is because this concept is another difficult concept to take in if you've never heard it before. But there are multiple heavens, so to speak. There's a first heaven, second heaven, third heaven. Paul was taken to the third heaven. The first heaven is actually where we live now. It's the area below the mountaintops, but we'll talk about that more next week. So the moment that Daniel prayed, this angel was dispatched from the third heaven, and then it had to combat this principality in the second heaven before it made its way to Daniel. We see that in verse 13. "But the prince of the kingdom of Persia," that's talking about this principality, this high-ranking chief general, this angel, or a demon, "withstood me 21 days, and behold, Michael, one of the chief princes," so this was an elect angel, one of God's angels, the archangel Michael, "came to help me, for I had been left alone there with the kings of Persia." And this kings is plural, so that means that there were many, or at least more than one, high-ranking generals over this nation of Persia. And they were opposing this angel as it was coming to Daniel. Now, obviously, this was Old Testament. What we're going to talk about more next time is, as New Testament believers, we have authority over these principalities. And so that should not be a problem for us if we are binding the work of those enemies. It doesn't matter how high-ranking they are still far below Jesus, and we are in Christ. Therefore, we are far above them as well. So that is the first category that Paul mentions here. Principality, it's a high-ranking territorial spirit that is over a region. And this will be a large region like a nation. But then we have, in Ephesians chapter 6, the second category, powers. He says, "We do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers." So powers is the Greek word exousias. This Greek word, if you look up the definitions, it means to have the right to speak or to act in a situation without looking for or waiting for approval. It means as granted by a superior or a recognized agency. So this is also a high-ranking demon, but it is below the principality. So if you were to imagine a president of a country, and then you have governors or mayors, the governors and the mayors would be the powers that Paul is talking about. They're still high-ranking, but they are not as high-ranking as the principality. Rick Renner said that this is delegated license. So this means that there are these very high-ranking territorial spirits over vast areas, maybe even nations. And then there are spirits that dominate more localized areas like states, cities, counties, things like that, depending on how the country is set up. And so this is what I was talking about a couple of weeks ago when I said that I'm not trying to be prophetic or anything. It just seems like there is a spiritual oppression in this area, which manifests itself in the form of drug use and alcoholism, laziness, just the overall poverty mindset where people are stuck in their current situation and refuse to do what they need to do to get out of that situation. That could be because of a power, exousias, in this area. And they do still operate in the world because although Satan is defeated, like my dad said Sunday, Satan does have the lease on the earth. And so it's up to us as new believers, New Testament believers, to bind the work of the enemy, to keep them in their place of defeat, and therefore keep ourselves in our place of victory. So the first category that Paul mentioned was principalities, high-ranking territorial generals The second category is powers, exousias, and that is still a high-ranking demonic force, but it is below the principality. The third category that Paul mentions in Ephesians chapter 6, verse 12, is rulers of the darkness of this age. The King James Version says world, but that is not the Greek word cosmos. That is a word that is better translated age, and we'll talk more about that later as well. But we're going to look at the word ruler right now. The word ruler is the most complicated Greek word that we have to discuss in this teaching. It's a combination of two words, cosmo and krateo. So we know what cosmos means. That's the entire cosmic order. It can be referring to the entire created universe. It can be referring to the earth. It can be referring to the spiritual realm. It can refer to all the systems of the world, both the physical world and the supernatural world. And then the word krateo means power, or to gain control of. And when you combine these words, you get cosmokrateros. If you have a Strong's Concordance, or really, I'll go ahead and recommend an online tool. It's called Blue Letter Bible, where it has an online Strong's Concordance, and then all kinds of study tools available as well. So it's got links to different lexicons, how the word was used in the Greek culture at the time. It's a very good tool to use, and I use it often whenever I'm preparing messages. But if you look at the Strong's Concordance, you'll see that this word is referring to gaining possession of, or to be a master of, or to obtain. And Rick Renner had a difficult time really understanding what this word cosmokrateros meant. It means power that is organized, harnessed, and arranged, but he knew that there was something more referring to this word or something more relating to this word that he was not seeing. It was a word that was used to describe the training of military troops at the time. And in ancient Greek literature, it would describe boot camp or military training centers. So he knew that there was something related to the military training that Paul is talking about here when he says rulers of the darkness of this age. Now, darkness is not anything too complex. It just means death, right? It's anything that is apart from God. And of this age is a period of time. But the rulers, he was having some struggles understanding rulers. And I also, as I was studying this verse and this word, I wasn't having any success with this lexicon, with the Blue Letter Bible. I could not find a good definition of cosmokrateros. It would just say a world ruler or a world leader. And so I pulled out my other lexicon. That's why I brought these books tonight. I wanted to show you how serious this study got. So this is a more in-depth lexicon, which goes into further descriptions of all of the Greek words in the Bible. And that book actually did have a very appropriate definition of this word, cosmokrateros. It means spiritual beings that have parts of the cosmos under their control. And when I read that, I was reminded of what Rick Renner had said about power being organized and military training, because we know what cosmos is. And so these spiritual beings have parts of the cosmos or parts of the spiritual realms or the structures of the spirit under their control, the demonic spiritual realm. But to really drive this point home, Rick Renner gave an excellent example, and it's stuck with me ever since I heard him mention it a few years ago, that really shows what cosmokrateros is and what Paul is talking about here with the rulers of the darkness of this age. He was teaching in a church several years ago when he was confused about this word, cosmokrateros, and so he just kind of set it aside and thought he would get to it later. But he was teaching in a church. He gave an altar call, and people came up for prayer, and there was a man who had his hands behind his back, and his wife who had her hands in her pocket like that. And they weren't even Christians. They were just there as visitors, and they came up for prayer. And Rick Renner said, "How can I pray for you?" And the man pulled his hands out from behind his back, and they were just completely clenched up and deformed. And Rick Renner said, "Okay, what happened to your hands?" And the man, not being a Christian, he explained it in a way that a Christian who understood the supernatural realm would. He said, "I felt something come upon my hands, and over the course of a period of time, my hands became deformed until they were just this lump of flesh that is unusable. And then I felt that thing lift off of me." And then he looked at the wife and he said, "Okay, so why are you here?" She pulled her hands out of her pockets and they looked identical to the husband's hands. And she said, "It's the craziest thing, but I'll tell you what I told the doctors. When he felt that thing lift off of him, I felt it come on my hands, and then my hands got just as bad as his, and then I felt it lift off of me." And when Rick Renner heard this, his mind immediately jumped back to this word cosmokrateros, and it made sense. This military training is similar to a soldier who specializes in a particular form of combat or a particular type of weaponry. So Paul is saying here that the rulers of the darkness of this age are demons who are specialized in certain attacks. It could be migraine headaches. It could be poverty or drug use or alcoholism. In the case of this man and the wife, it was the deformity in their hands. Another example is with the Bushes. President Bush, the first one, his wife, Barbara Bush, was diagnosed with a rare thyroid condition called Graves' disease. And then 2 years later, President Bush was diagnosed with that same disease. And this disease was so rare that doctors said it's unheard of that two people in the same house would have this disease, much less get diagnosed with it within 2 years of each other. And I looked this up online, confirmed it. There are several respectable outlets that have this documented. But it didn't even end there, because shortly after President Bush was diagnosed with Graves' disease, their dog was diagnosed with lupus, which is a related autoimmune disorder. And so this is another indication that there is was a spiritual attack going from person to person in that family. And we see this often. We may not recognize it as a demonic attack, but we see generation to generation that the same condition will come upon people, or even within a family, it will go from one person to the next. And we need to be aware that that is one of the categories of demonic forces. Now, that does not mean that that is always the case. Remember, there are many reasons why bad things happen. There's a curse in the earth. There's ignorance. But really, in the end, I unintentionally skipped over this part when I was teaching about that. It really does all go back to Satan. Whether he is directly attacking the person or not, he is the source of all of that death. So no matter what the cause is, it's always Satan. It just may manifest because of the curse in the earth or because of our ignorance. I meant to say that last time, but I forgot. But anyway, so we often see things like generational curses, which could be because of a demonic attack, a demon that is specialized in a particular form of attack. I brought a lot of books tonight, but I thought this was appropriate. This is a book that talks about the world before the flood, but I'm actually not going to talk about that topic tonight. There's a chapter in this book where the author goes through the Kennedy family and all of the hardships that this family had undergone over the past several decades. So just listen to this quickly. 1941, Rosemary Kennedy was the third child who was mentally challenged and remained institutionalized until her death. 1944, Joseph Kennedy Jr. died at the age of 29 in World War II. Kathleen Cavendish in 1948 was killed at the age of 28. That was the wife of her husband who was killed in World War II. She was killed at the age of 28 in a plane crash. 1963, Jackie Kennedy, the wife of President John Kennedy, gave birth to 2 stillborn children. We all know what happened to John F. Kennedy in 1963. He was assassinated when he was president at 46 years old. Robert Kennedy, 1968, was assassinated while running for president at 42 years old. 1969, Ted Kennedy was a part of the Chappaquiddick incident where he drove off a bridge into a pond and killed a young lady in the car. His wife had a miscarriage, which resulted in a scandal that made him unable to run for president. 1973, Joseph Kennedy II. Joseph was driving in a car which crashed. His passenger, Pam Kelly, was permanently paralyzed. 1973, Ted Kennedy Jr. had to have his right leg amputated due to bone cancer at 12 years old. 1984, David Kennedy, son of RFK, overdosed on cocaine and died at 28 years old. 1997, Michael Kennedy died in 1997 in a skiing accident at the age of 39. 1999, John F. Kennedy Jr. killed in a plane crash. His wife and sister-in-law also died. He was 38 years old. 2009, Ted Kennedy died of a brain tumor. 2011, Kara Kennedy, diagnosed with lung cancer. In 2002, died of a heart attack at the age of 52. 2012, Mary Kennedy, the estranged wife of RFK Jr., committed suicide by hanging at the age of 52. Now, the author of this book wasn't talking about generational curses, but it does appear that there is some sort of spiritual opposition against that family for some reason or another. Nothing to do with politics, or, I'm not saying that they were doing great things for the kingdom of God and Satan was opposing them. Satan comes to steal, kill, and destroy, and when given the opportunity, he's going to do that. And for whatever reason, it seems that the Kennedy family throughout the decades has been a target for spiritual oppression. And it may manifest in a way of various disasters over time, or it may be that throughout the generations, each member of that family falls into the same type of destructive behavior, whether it's drug use or some kind of a disease that passes through generations. And doctors will say that someone is genetically predisposed to a certain condition, and because of the curse in the earth, there may be a genetic component to diseases, but we as children of God are not subject to that curse. Therefore, that genetic disease has no right to exist in our family. So this also could be a demonic attack from a ruler of the darkness of this age. And this would also apply to Paul's thorn in the flesh. He was given a demon, or a demon was specifically assigned by Satan to oppose him because of his work that he was doing for the ministry and the amount of revelation that he had. That was in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 7. You don't have to turn there. We talked about that last time. But he had a demon which was specifically assigned to oppose him, and that may be an example of a ruler of the darkness of this age. Now, I mentioned this word that is translated age in the New King James Version, or world in the King James Version. Although it's translated world, that is not the word cosmos, it is the word aeon, which deals with an extended period of time, which means these demonic forces are here for an extended period of time. Even though they are defeated, they are still here because they have the lease on the earth. And that lease is going to run out, and then Jesus is going to return and they will be cast into the bottomless pit. But Paul still had to deal with this thorn in the flesh, even though Satan is defeated. And so Jesus told Paul, "My grace is sufficient for you," meaning even though these demons are here and they are attacking you, we are victorious over them because we have the grace of God in us. Now, we haven't talked about this fourth one, spiritual hosts of wickedness in the heavenly places. We will talk about that next week, but before we go, I just want to mention quickly what we do with this knowledge of how Satan operates. And I'm not going to get into detail, but just so we end on a high note here, so you don't run out of here worried about these demonic forces. We need to remember that Paul is writing all this, and then he immediately goes into the armor of God teaching. So, knowing what we know about Satan's spiritual forces, we also should know that they are no match for us because of the armor of God. Matthew chapter 28 says that we have authority in the name of Jesus. Colossians chapter 2 says that Jesus spoiled principalities and powers. Those are the same words that we see in Ephesians chapter 6, verse 12. And Jesus is far above all principalities, powers, might, and dominion, every name that is named not only in this age, but that to come, and we are in him. I heard a minister named Dwayne Sheriff talk about sickness and our victory one day, and I'll end on this note. He said, "You are not sick trying to get healed. You are healed, and Satan is tempting you to be sick." And that is the mindset that we should have, not only in the realm of sickness, but really anything that Satan comes at us with. We are already victorious, and he is tempting us to step out of our position of victory. So even though we see these 4 categories of demonic forces, we know that they are no match for us because of our position in Christ.